Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite short stories ever since I read it for the first time, Everyday Use by Alice Walker. Anytime we look at a short story, it's always good to start on the ground floor with just the basic facts. Short stories are sort of an interesting form that I'm still understanding as I study them over the years, but they're not movies. Novels are more like movies. These are like powerful little scenes, maybe even little music videos. One author I read said that short stories pick up at the end of the action. Everything's already happened, all the characters are developed, we're just at sort of a moment of crisis, and we're seeing how it all turns out at the end. One good question to ask about short stories or plays or novels or any event in literature is what in this story makes today different from every other day? And in this story, we are witnessing the day that Wangero D returns to her childhood home to visit with her mother. She's been away at college and she's had a lot of changes and she's come back with a new attitude. When we just look at the basic structural choices that Alice Walker has made, the story is written in first person. It's the only first person story out of the three we're reading this unit. And it's written from the mother's point of view, whose last name is Johnson, and that's really all we know about her. The story is obviously set in the country, in the deep south. It's a cabin in the middle of a pasture, and this tends to be a poor family. They can't afford chairs, so they have benches made, a lot of stuff that's homemade. And the story has four characters. There's the mother, the narrator, Maggie, the younger sister who lives at home, who's about to get married to John Thomas, and then Dee, or Wangero, the older sister who's been away at college, and Hakima Barber, or Assalamu Alaikum, who is Dee's college boyfriend. What's our narrator like? Where we start with who's telling the story? Well, she describes herself as a large, big-boned woman with rough, man-working hands. She's an African-American mother of two. We don't know where the father is. She's thoughtful. She's definitely thinking and has opinions and ideas, but she's not educated in a formal sense. And she is tough. She can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. She can work outside all day, breaking ice to get water for washing. And she can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. So she's a tough country lady. She is intimidated or at least wary of white men, though. It seems to me that she says, that I have talked to them with always 1 foot raised in flight, with my head turned in whichever way is farthest from them. She says that she never asked about her education when it stopped because African Americans didn't ask a lot of questions back then. So I would never say she's a submissive person, but she has good reason to fear white people. Now, on your sheet, I think that we have two columns to talk about the different characteristics that these two characters, because we have foils, we have sisters, and what are they like? And I hope that you could do this on your own, but I'll also go over it over here. We'll start with Maggie, since she's the first sister we really meet. She is clearly nervous. She's described as hopeless, meaning she doesn't have a lot of hope for her life. She kind of is used to losing. She doesn't think things are going to go her way. She's very deferential to her sister and her mother. She's envious and in awe of her confident sister. She's very quiet. And she feels she's homely and unattractive, partly because of the burn scars that are down her arms. And we hear that the previous house they lived in did burn down. And she walks, says her mother, like a shy, lame animal. Her sister Dee is a good foil because she's in every way different than her. She's attractive and confident. When she was younger, she sort of hated her house and hated Maggie too. And that's one of the interesting things about the story is she seems to love the house now that she's returned to it. But she is traditionally, I think, growing up in snobby, condescending. She has a scalding, critical sense of humor. She loves her learning. She thinks she knows best. And in this story, we see that even though she rejected where she came from growing up, now she's coming back and reclaiming her African heritage. And we can tell this by the way she's dressing. She's wearing traditional African garb. She's changed her name from her oppressed name. She no longer wants to be called Dee. She's using a lot of Muslim greetings and things like that and dating a Muslim, obviously. The style of the story is very plain-spoken, but it's eloquent and occasionally even poetic. This story has a lot of good dialogue in it, which makes it particularly fun, and good descriptions. And it is got some hilarious moments, particularly in misunderstandings. When Dee says she changed her name because she didn't like her oppressed name, her mother says, "You know as well as me that you was named after your Aunt DC," which is kind of funny. She also mistakes Hakim's Assalamu alaikum, which is a Muslim greeting for his name. She calls him Assalamu alaikum for a while because she doesn't know that that's a Muslim greeting. So what's interesting about this is comparing and contrasting the two sisters' attitude toward the past, and then from them, from those two characters, extrapolating to what Alice Walker might think is the appropriate attitude toward the past. But if Dee hated the past when she was growing up, she loves it now. Everything delights her, presumably because it makes her authentic, and it gives her a story to tell of her rise from poverty and oppression into an elite status as an educated woman. She's taking pictures as a memory, and she's making sure that the house is in all the Polaroids. When she sees the benches, she's delighted that her father made those and she doesn't really recognize that it's because they couldn't afford chairs. She just thinks the benches are cool. And she starts taking things, right? She takes the butter churn top that was whittled by her Uncle Buddy, and she wants the dasher too, and she's going to use them as art pieces in her house. And she doesn't know who whittled them, or the history of the person who whittled them the way Maggie does. Maggie's the one who says Uncle Buddy did that, but his real name was this, and everybody called him that. Maggie knows her history. Dee Wanjero wants to use these things as decoration in her apartment. And they're sort of like the entrance of something that it escalates into the quilts, right? This is such good language, I had to just put it up here on the PowerPoint. Mama, Wanjero said, sweet as a bird, can I have these old quilts? You know, she knows she's asking for something that is kind of precious because it's made up of pieces of clothing going way back far into the family. Now, notice there's something that happens right after she asks that. The mother says, I heard something fall in the kitchen, and a minute later the kitchen door slammed. This is obviously Maggie, who's upset about the quilts being taken away. Something falls and then she slams the door. A little bit happens, and then the mother says, the truth is, I said, I promised to give them quilts to Maggie for when she marries John Thomas. She gasped like a bee had stung her. Maggie can't appreciate these quilts, she said. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. Everyday use, right? The title of the story. Yes, and we need to think about that. Like, how is that wrong for Maggie to take these quilts and use them for everyday use? And we're at, out of the 3 stories we've read this unit, we're at a third story that has an epiphany, and this is how it's described. It's the climax of the story where the mother has a realization. When I looked at her, and she's looking at Maggie giving up the quilts like that, something hit me in the top of my head and ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and shout. I did something I'd never done before, hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangero's hands and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there with her mouth open. Maggie's never been chosen or hugged by her mother. And notice that the mother uses the diction of Miss Wangero because she's so high and mighty and looking down on them. She makes a decision. The mother decides that Maggie's value of the past is maybe more the ethical choice here, that everyday use is better than making them art on the wall. And we have this delicious, ironic moment at the end, right? You just don't understand, Wangero said, as Maggie and I came out to the car. What don't I understand? I wanted to know. Your heritage, she said. And you have to question on what level and in what ways does Wangero understand her heritage, and how does the mother and Maggie understand the heritage, and how are those different? And we have to think about that, because in any great work of literature, we want to look for that complexity. The 2 sisters are foils to each other, and they have different attitudes toward the past. Dee is explicit in her attitude, and Maggie's is more inferred. But even the mother is complex. She's not exactly just stubborn and closed-minded. Clearly, the changes that Dee has gone through are difficult for her to accept, but she isn't fully condemning them if you read the story carefully. She seems to like some of them. So the differing attitudes toward the past that each sister exhibit leads to the big question of the story. What is a person's proper attitude toward the past, according to the author? And that's what we want to do when we interpret this story into a paragraph in which we contrast the 2 sisters and we try to extrapolate into what the author's trying to tell us about a proper and ethical attitude toward the past.